Today, looking at the potential of blockchain and how the decentralized economy is going to evolve the timeless model of trade. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bettina Warburg.
Our future economy will be much more decentralized. We've all heard stories that allude to some of what we can imagine this future to look like. Things like drones that'll do last mile delivery, or even AIs that'll negotiate with one another in their own language because it's more efficient. Or one I heard last week about how we will be 3D printing sushi. But often these are stories that can be kind of distracting. They don't tell us a lot about how our economy itself is being altered or shaped by new technologies that are about decentralization. So today what I want to do is talk about one of those technologies in particular, blockchain technology, but do so using some guiding economic principles to help us sort of imagine what's actually changing underneath as we start using these technologies. And I like this quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson in particular. He said, "The man who grasps principles can successfully select his own methods. The man who tries methods ignoring principles is sure to have trouble." So we'll talk a little more about some of the principles to pay attention to. And this story actually starts pretty far back. If we think back to our early agrarian days, we used to trade much more directly one-to-one. We had a lot more certainty about our transactions because we lived in smaller communities and we knew each other. As our trade routes expanded, as our societies grew more complex, we ended up with a lot greater uncertainty about our trade and exchange. And so to deal with that uncertainty, we ended up building institutions. Different institutions like banks, governments, marketplaces, really just tools that helped codify rules of exchange, protocols, and helped us actually execute our transactions with one another at greater and greater scale by lowering our uncertainty about one another. If you fast forward, we ended up actually putting these same institutions online. We built platform marketplaces like Amazon, eBay, Alibaba. Really just digital intermediaries that allowed us to expand yet again how we do our trade. So today, we're seeing an evolution of this exact same principle. We're able to expand how we do trade, but we're able to do it with a technology instead of an institution. So blockchain technology is largely about being able to exchange value, but actually directing that value one-to-one, the same way we did in our early agrarian days, because we have a lot greater certainty in our situations and our exchanges. And this is the principle to pay attention to. When we think about this new technology, it's really just driving the same story. It's an evolution of our entire economic history about lowering uncertainty in order to expand our ability to trade. So blockchain gets a lot of hype and a lot of buzz, especially on the topic of cryptocurrencies. I want you to put that all aside. What I want to actually focus on as an analogy is something that might feel very archaic, but it's the analogy of the checkbook. If you really want to understand blockchain, the checkbook is a great example. Because when we go to write a check, we're essentially writing the terms of a transaction. I'm going to pay you X dollars, and I've signed it with my name, and then it has an address and my bank details associated with it. And in order to execute that transaction, we need my bank and your bank and many other steps. Now, if I've written all of the checks in a given checkbook, I end up with all the carbon copies left over, sort of describing all of the different transactions I made over the course of that checkbook. In blockchain, that's basically a block of data. It's description of all of the transactions that have happened over a certain period of time. They get cryptographically lumped together and linked to a set of previous transactions, creating a long ledger of transactions. Now, what's interesting is with blockchain, instead of your bank and my bank really validating that exchange of value and performing it, we're using a network of computers to do this function. So there's a network of computers that are essentially going through and validating, coming to agreement on what has happened in a specific block of data, and then attaching it to the chain. This is a system that has no central administrator and essentially is a decentralized database architecture that is held across a peer-to-peer network. And one important thing to think about when we talk about blockchains is they're evolving actually similarly to the way our internet evolved. When our internet first came about, it's public, anyone can read or write to it, but we also saw the emergence of intranets, scoped internets for companies or specific groups or industries, and this is also true in the blockchain space. We're seeing public networks emerge, like the Bitcoin network or the Ethereum network, which anyone can read or write to. But we also have private networks and many different kinds of permissioning architectures for those. So you can scope a given blockchain to a company or an industry or a specific purpose and alter the governance for it. So it's a helpful tool to think about. It's similar to an intranet. Now, this all started in about a decade ago with the emergence of the Bitcoin white paper that described Bitcoin as a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. But we have evolved significantly since even just a decade ago. We saw the emergence of the Ethereum network in 2015, which essentially took a blockchain, sort of Bitcoin as the first blockchain, and generalized a lot of the functionality. And so instead of saying we now have a network that can secure all of these financial transactions of Bitcoin as an asset, Ethereum looked at this and said, we can do this, you can use the same architecture and actually generalize it to transact any kind of information. Today, we're seeing a huge growth in the kinds of blockchains that people are creating. There's a lot of different protocols out there. Obviously, there's Hyperledger. And there's also Definity, which is aiming to be really more of an internet computer. And this brings me to an important principle to keep in mind when you think about blockchains. And it's that essentially blockchains have evolved to become modern-day global decentralized virtual computers. You should think of them as a computer that you can use and write applications on top of. So the technology stack for a blockchain is not that different than the tech stack we're used to in sort of our everyday digital life. We have core infrastructure for our internet that's, SMTP, TCP/IP, the protocols that make up our communication network. In blockchain, we have core protocols as well, the protocols that define the Ethereum network or define Bitcoin. Above them, we have middleware. In our digital lives, that's APIs and libraries. In blockchain, that's clients, so a way to communicate with the core infrastructure. And then at the top, we have applications. For our digital lives, that's Uber and email and all of the different tools we use on a day-to-day basis. In blockchain, applications are really sort of an experimental ground. People are building lots and lots of prototypes of different proofs of concept in different industries of how you might use a blockchain at an application layer. And often, it really requires thinking about this space quite differently, because if you're doing application design in this space, you're really designing decentralized software. Now, what makes this quite interesting is that the core of any application in a blockchain environment is something called a smart contract. Smart contracts, you should think back to that checkbook example. If you're writing a check, you're actually kind of writing a small contract. It's an IOU, and it's just written out in it's sort of the terms of our deal. For smart contracts, what we're saying is we can take any kind of terms, and as long as we can write them to be computer readable, we can execute them across a blockchain, across a decentralized database architecture. So this actually unlocks a lot of opportunity. It's really saying we can automate business logic. and governance. We can take any kind of written conditionality and turn it into computer-readable code and execute it on its own without middlemen. This isn't the same as saying it's a legal contract, right? You could take legal contracts or standardized contracts and make them smart contracts, but it's obviously not necessarily tied to the law. So I've talked a lot about how blockchains are actually an extension of some of our economic principles of really lowering our uncertainty so that we can transact at greater scale and opportunity in our trades. I want to actually go one layer deeper than sort of this global economy and talk about what is going to change underneath. And the point here is that actually everything has a supply chain. People don't like to talk about supply chain often. It's not the most sort of sexy term, but it's really core to basically our entire global economy. Every product we have that's physical, every digital asset we use, whether it's content or anything, it came from somewhere, it had an origin, and it went through a number of transactions to get to an end consumer. And those transactions create value for that product over time. So if we think about our supply chains, if trade itself is capable of extending into even greater realms because of technologies like blockchain, then we actually need to think about the decentralization that's going to happen underneath that trade, the decentralization of our supply chain functions. So how we design, how we make, and how we deliver all of the different value we create in our supply chains today. So at Animal Ventures, we think we're entering this golden era, this golden age of supply chain innovation. And it's for a lot of reasons. It's not just blockchain. We're seeing a preponderance of IoT devices and sensors go into our supply chains, right? In manufacturing, in production, in logistics. We're seeing tools that are from AI really start to come into our supply chains as well. We're seeing additive manufacturing, 3D printing get much more sophisticated. And now we have also blockchain that's trying to unlock the value in those other technologies, actually taking Industry 4.0 even further. So we do a lot of prototyping with different industry leaders that are in supply chain heavy spaces. So pharmaceuticals, healthcare, retail, trucking, and logistics. These are all places that people are starting to experiment with using blockchain in their supply chains and to think about how it might change their future business opportunities. We have a paper coming out called Asset Chains, which describes how we think about the future of supply chain innovation using blockchain. That comes out in May. We're actually also hosting a summit on exactly this topic called Flow, so stay tuned for that. But this golden age of supply chain, it's not just about, It's not just about blockchain. We're already seeing a lot of these technologies make our supply chains smarter. So this is how to think about these technologies interacting. At the very top, we have tools for intelligent decision making, some of the predictive analytic tools, AI tools, smart algorithms, ways of thinking about forecasting demand differently. Below it, in our supply chains, we see a lot of data gathering. All of those IoT devices and smart devices that are on factory floors are giving us a lot richer landscape of what's happening at any given moment. But the problem is we've never had this bottom layer, this idea of maintaining a network state. When we have intelligent systems and a lot of data to go off of, we actually need a layer of shared reality. And that's often not the case because in supply chains in particular, you're usually talking about one company, or even if you're part of a larger supply chain, you don't have visibility into the partners you might be working with. The data is siloed, and you use alternate systems. So what's interesting about blockchain is that it actually deals with this sort of missing layer, this space around how do you create a shared reality across non-trusting parties in order to unlock a lot more potential for executing our trade. And for us, we think about this as actually unlocking autonomous network state. So go beyond humans being able to transact with lower uncertainty And think about the fact that machines don't have a transaction layer today in order to do anything, right? So they might be smart and they might have data, but how are they going to transact and validate and verify any given information? They need rules, they need smart contracts to tell them what to do, and then they need some kind of database architecture that will actually allow them to use their rules against that data in order to make any kind of transaction. So what this unlocks is really machine trust. It's not the best term because we're saying we're lowering the need for trust, but really machines have not had this infrastructure while humans have. So we like to think about this as a future where we can even consider robots as sort of a next consumer class, right? Robots will have wallets. And that's not just the stories I described at the beginning that are already happening today, where we can see technology really advancing, where AIs are going to negotiate, or we're going to have drone delivery. Those are things that are going to get even more prevalent in society when we have the ability for machines to transact autonomously. So people often ask us at Animal Ventures, how do you sort of move from surviving to actually thriving in a decentralized economy? And I like to point to this older picture. This is a diagram from Paul Barron's work in 1964 on distributed communications. He was working on how to make our very centralized communications architecture, the diagram on the far left, into a more resilient architecture in the face of the Cold War. And what we ended up with was packet switching and then inevitably our current internet. And I think this is a really big point. A lot of our technologies are sort of biased towards decentralization. It makes them work better. It's what they're geared toward doing. And so Kevin Kelly, who's a great author, wrote a book called The Inevitable, also was the co-founder of Wired magazine. He writes a lot about this idea that our technologies have inherent biases to the way that they're built, and that leads to certain inevitabilities. So if this diagram essentially led to the inevitability of our current internet, we should be thinking the same way about what blockchain leads to. What are some of the inevitabilities of these newer technologies that are going to influence how our economy works? So for me, that means we need to actually be thinking about how machines, humans, and new forms of organization are going to be working together and unlocking value, because it won't just be humans transacting in an economic structure. We're going to be working very closely alongside machines. And that is where we will drive value creation. So if you get to how are we going to thrive in this space, I actually think we need to become a lot more like Leonardo da Vinci's. This is a diagram of his flying machine drawing. And he was this combination of both artist and scientist. He was a designer and a creative, but he also experimented and built prototypes. And we're going to need that combination more and more, because in many ways, a lot of our systems are going to be automated and decentralized and push a lot of human activity out to the edges. But that means we get to use systems, we get to use a more autonomous supply chain, for instance, to run simulations, experiments, learn faster. So leveraging technology and its automated abilities to actually help us learn and prototype faster in the future. So I think this is really the struggle for the next era. This is how we're going to have to define what happens to our economy. If we can transact in totally new ways with lowered uncertainty through these more decentralized technologies, how exactly should we be performing our work? So that's the question I leave you all with. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bettina. So we have some time for questions, and I'm sure plenty of you have questions. Remember, all you have to do to submit a question is go on Twitter and use the hashtag ThinkQ&A, all a single word. You don't even have to capitalize if you don't want to. Okay, I have questions for you.
Sure.
So the reducing uncertainty piece cropped up several times in your presentation.
Yes.
What would you say to people who go, hey, the current banking system, the way we work, the way my supply chain currently functions, I'm not uncertain about that at all. Blockchain, I'm uncertain. What's the answer to them?
I think that's a fair point because it's a challenging technology to wrap your brain around, and we're just at the early days of seeing it evolve and starting to see use cases where people are actually running experiments on what is going to be different. So I think it's totally fair to say that the learning curve is a long one, and it's a hard one. For us, I see a lot of benefit in spaces like compliance innovation. It's not something people often think of or want to talk about. They're more interested in the cryptocurrencies or the ICOs that are going on. But in reality, this is a tool for automating business logic, automating things that we already do and need a lot of validity around. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity to actually make things more certain that we aren't very certain about right now.
And to an extent, it's like a kid in a candy store moment, because we as organizations, as businesses, know that there is great potential here. There are so many directions we could go in, but where should we put our first coins, not Bitcoins, but regular coins? Where should we be investing time, effort, resources, research when it comes to blockchain?
I mean, absolutely in prototyping, because you learn a lot about your business problem and how this technology is going to change that. I mean, some of the trade-offs that we experience in businesses today won't exist in the future, and there will be new trade-offs you have to deal with. So I think experimenting in this space early and often is really important.
So almost like running simulations?
Yeah, I mean, you're building prototypes. It doesn't mean you're using your live data of your company or you're putting it in a live production environment, but you're capable of actually exploring how would this work? How does this interface with my existing legacy technology, which is going to be really important too.
We have a pretty savvy audience in the room, but there are many out there, some would say because of the way the media has approached this subject, that believe that blockchain is a currency. It's not, and you're going to tell us again why it's not, but there is some crossover, is there not?
Yes, there's definitely crossover, but it's important, I think, to hone in on that principle around we're actually seeing third generation versions of this technology push much more towards being a decentralized computer that's virtual. It's a virtual machine that you can run applications on top of, and that opens up a lot of possibility. And I think it's a mind shift from saying, oh, it's a currency. Yes, there's plenty of people who are trading alternative currencies that are based on blockchains today, but that's not necessarily where we're headed.
And it's funny, we were talking yesterday, I spent some time about 3 or 4 weeks ago with the former head of the SEC, Mary Shapiro, and we were discussing on stage Bitcoin, Ethereum, and blockchain, and she basically said, and I'm paraphrasing, huge fan of blockchain, not so much on the cryptocurrency. The blockchain seems to have captured people's imaginations. Let's go to Twitter now, don't forget, think Q&A. Here's a question, blockchain and decentralized economies versus banks, question mark? It's a nice broad question, and that comes from Mr. Carrion.
Okay, well I think, people have paid a lot of attention to the banking and sort of financial services realm in part because of this currency angle, as well as back office automation between banks and clearing houses and that kind of thing. But it's an interesting question because to some degree, the regulatory environment for an area like supply chain is very much aligned with this technology. If you look at what's happening in our world, we're seeing things like the Food Modernization Act, or there's another law that was passed both in the EU and in the US around serialization for pharmaceutical products down to the unit of sale. So you actually have to track and trace these products all the way through their entire history, which isn't done today. And so the regulatory environment for something like supply chain is pushing much more towards greater transparency, greater authenticity, greater ability to audit something in real time. And that's an area to be paying attention to rather than, yes, it can do certain efficient things in banking and it's an important space, but that's a very political space as well. And I think we'll see from the regulatory side that this might come first.
I can see a time in the future when we'll sit down for some roast chicken in a restaurant. We'll know everything that chicken did from the day it was born to the day it landed on a plate.
Sure. I mean, Cargill did a prototype on this on their turkeys for Thanksgiving. So there's lots of people experimenting on that. I love that. Absolutely.
Here's a question for you. Do you think banks will see blockchain as an opportunity to embrace, to enhance what they provide, or will they see it as a threat, something they need to stand up against?
I think they're seeing it as an opportunity. I mean, a lot of the banks are already working on either a coalition that they're, or consortium that they're a part of in order to produce something for their own industry. I think it does open opportunity outside of banks as well from a financial perspective, certainly. There's companies that are working on individualizing the ability to have your own hedge fund or things like that. So there's sort of creative potential around financial instruments for sure. And I do think banks are paying a lot of attention to that.
I'm sure they are. Okay, let's have a look at this. Doug says, how do we reconcile the benefits of blockchain with the energy and environmental costs of proof of work in untrusted networks? There are these stories, and of course they typically come out of the mining operations where phenomenal amounts of energy is required and is needed. So what's your answer to that?
It's a great question. I think it's very much associated with proof of work, and we're already moving into sort of different generations and different models of consensus mechanisms. So for instance, Dfinity, and there are certainly others that are looking at how do you actually create randomization and generate a beacon that moves you into a consensus algorithm that doesn't require doing proof of work. So I actually think if you hinge on that, we're looking at this as a new form of computing power, and we're sort of evolving our way forward. There's lots of areas that you can upgrade and sort of tweak depending on what your security level concerns are, what kind of risk model you have, what you're trying to achieve. So we're definitely seeing advances away from proof of work, and it'll just take some time to actually test them out. So I think the energy concern is more around mining and is much more around leveraging proof of work today.
Got it. Okay. A question comes in, how can IBM and other tech companies support partners in starting up with blockchain? So what role do the tech organizations and would IBM play in this?
I think there's a great role for how to help enterprises integrate this technology. I mean, systems integration is a really challenging area, and that's an important place to be playing, and we're not seeing a ton of that happen yet. So I think that's one place to imagine playing, and then I know there's a session after this that's being led by IBM on what is happening at IBM in the blockchain space. Right,
so steps are being made. Who will lead this, do you think? Do you think the tech companies will lead what happens next with blockchain? Or will it be organizations like yours?
I think there's a really interesting role for older organizations in this space because they understand infrastructure problems a lot better. If you get some snappy young startup, they don't necessarily have the background to know where the problems are going to exist in a given product or in a given sort of system that you're working on. So I think it's important to see that the science and the tech innovation of blockchain protocols is coming from technologists, academia, dev shops, all of those. And then we're seeing larger institutions actually come and say, here's my specific problem. Here's how I think blockchain can help in this area, and then going through a prototyping phase together.
There's a huge learning curve ahead, but what I love about what you're sharing with us is this is a global opportunity, because anyone from the smallest organization to the largest can find a space here and actually do something with this.
Yeah, and should be planning towards this kind of future. I think we take for granted some of the technologies we're used to dealing with today. It's not that hard to be an app developer today. But if you're starting to plan for, well, what does decentralized app development look like? What are the right languages to be learning if you're doing programming or any of those things? You have to start, I think, preparing along those lines as well, both for your own education and also to be, if you're planning to hire talent in the workforce.
You're hearing it here. If you've got kids, delete Peppa Pig from their iPads, put on blockchain videos. It's a good investment of time. Natasha asks, how could blockchain be a more reliable digital rights management system?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think there are a lot of experiments underway of how do you take, for instance, like Imogen Heap released her album on a blockchain, and so it's really, you can pay for and release a product even through a licensing mechanism using this technology where it's almost a clear swap in that direction. I think that's a great area to be paying attention to. Digital rights management will also be a big deal when we get into the additive manufacturing world of how many prints are you allowed to make from a given design and that kind of thing. So it will be growing, especially I think in that era.
You're a great evangelist for what blockchain represents. And I think that's part of the challenge for the industry, is understanding that this is something we can play with and is not something for the future we can ignore, which leads me to my question from Scott, which I love this question. Within a supply chain, there can be so many suppliers, he says. How can we get them all on board with blockchain? And this really goes to that element of, who's the evangelist, who's listening, and can we play if not all of them are on board?
Right. I mean, I think one area to think about is that you can actually incentivize people in new ways in order to participate. And if your contracts are designed in a way that you can incentivize somebody within your supply chain who maybe, oftentimes doesn't even have the credit of the top supplier. It's like, oh, you've got a prime contractor, and then way down at the bottom you have some little guy who's producing something for Boeing, maybe. But it's not clear to anybody else that they're producing for Boeing. So you can actually draw a much clearer line so that that individual or firm has the ability to take out credit or do things, do a lot of different potentially business activities based on being associated with a larger contract. So I think there's a lot of room actually for leveraging this tech for those kinds of innovations and incentivizing people to participate in a supply chain in that way.
Yeah, I think the incentivized piece is key. You have to show this is what's in it for you, so at least they'll have a go.
Yeah.
How about you? We're fascinated. How did you get involved in blockchain? What was the spark for you?
I'm a political scientist, actually. So for me, I was based in Silicon Valley. I was working at a research organization looking at future technologies that will change our governance. And I think governance more broadly, but how do we organize? How do we execute our transactions, create value? What's going to happen to our trusted intermediaries? Those are the kinds of questions that you ask about modern technologies. And I think I just stumbled into blockchain as one of those early technologies I thought actually made a big difference in how we can do a lot of our daily activity and sort of interact with each other in society. So you don't need to be a technologist to start thinking about blockchain, and I encourage you to do so.
Have a go.
Yeah.
I have two more questions for you. One's big, one's small. So the big question, what real world problems, big challenges that we're discussing at Think right now, do you think can at least in part be solved or ameliorated by blockchain? I
mean, there's a lot of interesting prototypes. Like there's a prototype going on with the World Food Program right now to think about how you do work with refugees and food supply. There's a lot of, the list goes on and on. How do you do food safety and supply chains? How do you think about identity in a new way? You could go in many, many directions. I think it is one of those more horizontal technologies that we need to start actually testing on some real world problems.
It's kid in the candy store again.
Yeah.
Okay, and I said one question was small. This is actually still relatively big. A number of questions came in on Twitter about cybersecurity, security in general. We see the stories all the time about how even the likes of Bitcoin and Coinbase can be hacked. Can blockchain be hacked? How do we protect against that? And if it happens, do we lose that trust that you said is so important?
So I think actually we're seeing a lot of interest in blockchain also from the resiliency standpoint. So many of our businesses and enterprises are built on sort of a firewall concept and just keep people out and protect your space. And that isn't really going to work so well in the future, right? Hackers only need to be right once. And so leveraging this kind of technology to actually create replicated data in a safe way and make sure it's encrypted is an important sort of security possibility, as well as, I would say from the cyber standpoint, all of the issues we've seen with blockchain to date come from places where we're re-centralizing wealth to some degree, right? So it's sort of the old, why rob a bank? That's where the money is.
Right.
So if you're going to deal with an exchange or any other area where you're getting a re-centralization of crypto tokens, then you will probably be an area where somebody would try to attack that. That's different than saying we can use this and leverage it as a more computing infrastructure where we're actually creating much greater resiliency and lowering our downtime on, is our data replicated, where is it replicated, how can we access it at any given moment if something happens in the world.
Well, it sounds like the potential is huge. There's a lot of interest, and I feel like we're just at the beginning. But Bettina Warburg, thank you so much for your time today. Ladies and gentlemen, Bettina Warburg, thank you. Thank you.